Hey, welcome back to the podcast. Today we are doing a case study cat episode where I am walking you through a case study of a client that I worked with just recently, actually. This is a 22-year-old female. She came to me with three main concerns. Number one being painful periods, number two being constipation and bloating, and number three being acne. One of the things that she shared with me in her intake form was that her period cramps were debilitating. And when they were happening month after month, they were causing her to have to cancel on plans, things that she had done. She would push through if it was for like work or school, but if it was something that was remotely optional, then she was missing out. And it was really starting to impact her social life and some of her relationships. Then, as far as the constipation and the bloating goes, she shared with me that constipation had really been an issue for her for the majority of her life, and she had tried various different things to work on that. Some of the things being probiotics, um, drinking coffee in the morning on an empty stomach, and then also taking Miralax. And she said that really none of those things helped. They might help for, one day or for a couple days. But then, the constipation was right back, and she felt like she was never really fixing that issue. And then as far as her acne went, she's very smart. She, functional medicine and trying to get to the root cause of issues is not new to her. She was already kind of aware of the fact that the acne that she was experiencing was probably tied back both to the constipation and the hormonal issues that she was having. So she really just wanted to come together and work together and get some testing done so that she could stop this cycle of having to absolutely dread her period every single month. She's very young. Like I said, she's 22. She's not married yet. She doesn't have kids. She this was really impacting her life and how she showed up in her relationships and her jobs and things. So we wanted to get that fixed for her. Anyone, it doesn't have to suffer like that, but especially for someone that's so young, that's just a miserable way to be. And we want to fix that when we can. So a couple of the other things that I noted on her intake form and just kind of some of my initial thoughts. Overall, she was already doing a lot of the right things. So she was someone that was working out kind of on what is her normal schedule. She did strength training. She was doing that at least twice a week. Plus, she's getting in a lot of just movement throughout her day. She did feel like she was motivated to exercise. She is someone that already is like not following a specific type of diet, but is conscious of her health and the things that she is eating and putting in her body. And she's not somebody that's just like relying on junk food, and consuming these crazy high calorie foods all the time. She was already conscious of those things. So, a lot there, like the foundational work had already been done, which is great because then we can bring in this testing and we can, just build upon that. She did drink caffeine sometimes, just one cup of coffee, not every day, usually 3 to 5 times a week. So that's great. Not dependent on that there. Didn't feel like she had an excessive amount of stress in her life and felt like the stress level that she did have, she's pretty easily can manage that on her own. So then we get into some of her period specific questions. And she did note that her cycles weren't always super regular, but when they were going through like time periods when they would be regular, they were about 26 days apart. She rated her period cramps at a 10 out of 10. Lots of PMS symptoms to include bloating, mood swings, increased feelings of depression, again, the constipation, breast tenderness, low energy, increased anxiety, and carb cravings. And then, of course, she mentioned the irregular cycles again, and she's not on any type of birth control. Hasn't been formally diagnosed with anything. She's young, doesn't have a lot of medical history, isn't on any prescribed medications, and was taking just a few supplements. So she had done some mineral drops. She was taking creatine and collagen. And none of those things are bad or I would take away. I think they're all three great things, and I continued all of those for her. So the testing that she did with me was an HTMA test. And that test, in case you're not familiar, that is a hair tissue mineral analysis. This gives us insight into over 38 different data points when we run this. This is why it's one of my favorite tests to do. And, in my practice, I do two functional tests. I do Dutch testing and I do HTMA testing. And then we can also order some labs, like regular blood labs, and compare those to functional ranges. But my focus is primarily on Dutch testing and HTMA testing because I have found them to be the most informative and the most important when it comes to trying to regulate and balance your hormones and get rid of hormonal symptoms. So, I would have loved to have done a Dutch test on her, but that was just not in the cards financially at this point. So I said, that's fine. It's totally fine. Let's just start with an HTMA test and this is a really important piece of information. And I think it's important for you guys to know and understand this. If you've ever had a conversation with me before about Dutch testing and HTMA testing and what they are and why I like to use them and why I like to do both of them and kind of why we need both tests or what exactly it is that each test is telling us, Dutch testing is great because it's a very comprehensive deep dive into what your hormone levels are. We get the female sex hormones, we get cortisol, which is that stress hormone. And we also get to see how the body is metabolizing those hormones, which can be very informative when it comes to trying to connect the dots between this is my hormone level and these are my symptoms and like where's the connection there. So Dutch testing tells us what the hormone levels are. But then HTMA testing really tells us what is off in the body that's causing this imbalance in the first place. So Dutch testing tells us what the hormone levels are. HTMA testing tells us why. And from a clinical standpoint, and from the standpoint of I need to get answers quickly, I need to take fast action, HTMA testing is the most actionable because it tells us the why. And we really need to know the why to take the most beneficial action. Now, there are definitely times when I do Dutch testing without HTMA, or I do obviously just HTMA. They do not always have to be run together, and there are specific scenarios where I wouldn't even recommend doing them together. But that just kind of gives you a little bit of kind of a high overview of like what the two tests are, why we do them, and what we're gaining from each test. So I'm not going to be able to go over this entire HTMA test in depth because then this podcast episode would be, lengthy. But I want to pull out some of the like key things that jumped out at me immediately when I got the test back. And that we can, that kind of guided the steps that we were taking. So right off the bat, when I look at this test, overall, there are no extreme deficiencies, which is great. And I honestly would expect that from a young 22-year-old that hadn't yet been pregnant or breastfeeding. So that is a great win. Then we look across the test here, excuse me, and I can see that her magnesium level is a little bit elevated. That tells me that her body probably needs more magnesium because her body is burning through it quickly, and that's why it's being pushed out the hair, and we see it show up on the hair test. Magnesium is needed for over 300 different processes in the body, and so we use it up very quickly. So that was one thing. Magnesium also is a relaxant to the muscles. So knowing that she has these cramps that she's rating out of 10 out of 10 every month, bringing on magnesium support is definitely going to help with that. So that was one big thing. The next thing that I noticed about her test here is her zinc level. Her zinc level is a little bit higher than the optimal range. It's still technically within the acceptable range, but it's not at that optimal level. And one of the big things that we look at and kind of it points us towards when there's an elevated zinc level is inflammation. Boom. And again, given that she's having all this constipation and then a couple other things on the test I'm going to get to in just a second, I can see where this zinc is probably elevated due to inflammation. Then we have to take into consideration the zinc and copper ratio because a lot of times the zinc and copper ratio is correlated to your estrogen and progesterone levels. So her zinc was more elevated than her copper. So that ratio was on the higher end, indicating some estrogen dominance or correlating to potential estrogen dominance. Now, with that, plus just me talking with her and going through her intake form and knowing what her symptoms are, we can assume that there is some estrogen dominance going on there, especially given the history of constipation, because when we are not having bowel movements on a regular basis, our bowel movements are how our body gets rid of excess estrogen. And if we're constipated and that stool is sitting in our body longer than it should, because we're constipated, we are reabsorbing that estrogen and it's going back into circulation instead of being excreted like it would if you were having good regular bowel movements. So, with all of that, I knew that we had some work to do there that further supported our need to try to address the constipation. And then the other thing that jumped out at me was some of her heavy metal levels. So, it's not uncommon for us to be excreting heavy metals. We are exposed to a lot of metals in our normal day-to-day life, in the products that we use. It's kind of unavoidable, even when we are trying to make conscious choices to use clean products or cleaner products. And then also something to note that I always share with my clients is that we can hang on to heavy metals for a long time in the body before they are detoxed and excreted if we're not like pushing that process with the body. So sometimes we see heavy metals show up and it's because we are in that time frame being exposed to something and the body's getting rid of it. But sometimes we see heavy metals show up that are being excreted, maybe even from like an exposure that happened quite some time ago, because since the exposure happened, our body has just been hanging on to it. But again, coming back to the constipation, knowing that that's been an issue for her for a long time, that's not just the way that the body gets rid of estrogen. It's also the way the body gets rid of a lot of different waste and toxins and things that we don't need. So that whole like aspect of reabsorption is going on with other things as well. And then we get down to the ratio section of the HTMA test. And I can see right off the bat that her calcium and potassium ratio is very elevated, which tells me that her body is having a hard time getting her thyroid hormone into her cells. The thyroid hormone has to get into the cell to be able to do its job. So, with traditional blood work, you are evaluating your body's ability to produce thyroid hormone. With an HTMA test, we're looking at, can the body get whatever amount it has produced, can it get it inside the cell? Because that's where it really has to be to do its job. Then we've already talked about the zinc and copper ratio. The other ratio that really stood out to me on this test was her sodium and magnesium ratio because it was very low. And that indicates some burnout and some adrenal fatigue, which just tells me that the body has been under stress for a while now and that it needs some support. So I already kind of chatted that we were going to support her magnesium, but we also needed to support her sodium and just make sure that she's doing that in a way that is like good forms of sodium, not just plain regular table salt. And that then also in turn is going to help support digestion because we have to have enough sodium to make stomach acid. And we need the stomach acid to properly break down food to make sure that we are absorbing it, the nutrients, vitamins and minerals from it, and then that it's in a, small enough form essentially that we are packaging it up and getting it ready to move out, for good bowel movements. So, that kind of just gives you like a high level overview of some of the key things we found from her test. Now, like I said, there was a lot more. I can't always get into all of it because there's just so much information, but that was kind of the most important things. Now, what I was really excited to share with you is that I've already done a 1 month follow up. And in fact, it's almost time for the 2 month follow up, but I've already done a 1 month follow up with this client. And that means that she has had probably one period since she got her care plan delivered by me. And what she shared with me on this check-in, this follow-up that we had together was incredible. So, her average period symptoms, she now rates at a 5 out of 10, and her PMS symptoms, she now rates at a 5 out of 10. So then she goes on, there's places where you can just kind of like type in information because you're answering a question for me. And so I'm asking, like, what has changed in the last month since we last did a check-in together? And she said, I didn't have any period cramps except for when I drank coffee, which is kind of a known thing. And so then, even then, the next section that you fill out is, what are your wins? Like, what things, big or small, have happened since we last chatted that have you feeling different? And she said, no period cramps, except for when I drank that coffee. And she said, this is the first time in a long time that I did not have any period cramps. So that's an incredible turnaround, because if you remember from that intake form, she was rating her period cramps a 10 out of 10, and she was having them every single month. And she was also experiencing them every day that she was on her period. So it's not just like one day of that suffering, it was multiple days. And in the very next month, after we made these tweaks and these shifts, she was able to see a significant decrease in that. And that's the power of getting the information on your unique body and what your unique body needs, and then taking aligned action with that. That is why you guys hear me say time and time again that HTMA testing and Dutch testing is so powerful, because it really helps you narrow in on exactly what you need to do, instead of knowing that there's lots of different strategies and supplements and great things out there that can help with these symptoms. But if you don't have testing to back up what you're doing, you're kind of just throwing spaghetti at the wall and hoping and seeing, hoping that something sticks and seeing what does stick. And it's a big experimentation process. And the testing and having those data points helps cut out that experimentation phase. So I hope that that's super helpful. If there are any of you guys listening that are like, yep, I need to get the testing because I need to really zero in on what my body needs, how I fix my specific symptoms or my specific scenario, then there are links for you in the show notes for ways that you can get testing for yourself and work with me. And I highly encourage you to check those out. And that's all I have for you guys today on the podcast episode. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I will chat with you next week.